I think that there are historical precedents and ingredients for the Jesus story, but I just don't see evidence of a real historical Jesus like there was, let's say, a historical Caesar Augustus about whom many of these same stories were told. But there's a historical figure who has been mythologized. I think Jesus is myth and fiction all the way down.
Will you take care of me throughout eternity? Are you a trinity or in me? Just semantics, merely politics, another heretic. I just want to know.
Does Jesus have any real connection with history? Well, without thinking about whether he might have been a myth or not, scholars that figured he was historical have long pointed to the slaughter of the innocents with King Herod, the attempts of Pilate to get Jesus to safety, and the Sanhedrin trial with Caiaphas and Annas. They pointed to these things as historical fictions. They're so implausible given what we know about these figures that this destroys all the connections between Jesus and secular history. And plus some ancients, some Jews and Christians couldn't quite agree on when Jesus lived. In the Toledoth Yeshu and in the Talmud, there are references to apparently the Christian Jesus living about 100 years earlier than the Gospels place him, in the time of Alexander Jannaeus and so forth. Irenaeus thought Jesus lived to be 50 years old and was crucified under the Emperor Claudius. And how did they not keep this straight if this was the central figure of the human race? And I think it's much like Superman. Well, a whole lot like Superman. They start out with an adult superhero. Then the comics sell so well they decided, let's say we do another comic, The Adventures of Superman when he was a boy. And so then you get Superboy, which is just like Jesus, 12-year-old at the temple and all the infancy gospels. And then DC Comics decided, how about a backup feature of Super Baby? And the toddler with a little, like the clothes we put our little kids in with a Superman symbol. Same thing. And then, as time went on, Superman's been around for nearly 80 years, they keep retconning, as they call it, revising the continuity in retrospect. So when did Superman arrive on Earth? Well, it must have been in the teens of the 20s, in the beginning of the 20th century, but later on they have to say, well, let's say he arrived from Krypton in the 50s, because they can't have him actually age. They can't have, they could get away with him, but Jimmy Olsen and Lois and the others can't become old codgers. So they kept revising it. So I think it's Superman versus Batman, Bruce Wayne's parents are killed in front of him when he's a young kid, and they just come out of the theater seeing Excalibur, which came out in 1981. I saw it in the theater, then it was only, relative to that. Well, that's what I think happened with Jesus, why they couldn't keep it straight. They had to keep updating him for church political reasons, because the bishops wanted to say, yeah, you can trust us and not those weirdo heretics, because you see, our guys who ordained us were educated by Jesus himself, and naturally you want that line of succession as short as possible, so Jesus would keep getting advanced in the timeline, just like Superman was, though for different reasons.
I just want, are we evolution? A revolution? Do we pass or fail? Create a living hell? Now that the tail is gone, what will sustain us? What will become of us?
Euhemerus was one of a number of ancient thinkers who had loyalty to the traditional myths of the gods and divine heroes, but he knew enough to realize you couldn't have witnessed Hercules going around doing these things, killing the Hydra and all that, like a Steve Reeves movie. He said, nah, it didn't happen. And so what Euhemerus did was to say, there must have been a historical figure at the bottom of this. Hercules must have been an extraordinarily strong guy, and Ares, the war god, must have been the Storm and Norman or the Patton of his day, and Asclepius, the healing god, he must have been like Marcus Welby, and these myths grew up around him. And Apollo, like I guess he ran a tanning salon in Athens or something, and Euhemerus and some others thought this, and this is why you have Herodotus, for instance, musing over when the historical Hercules lived, and he's looking at the different myths and saying, well, in this one he's with King so-and-so, that placed him about this date. Well, I don't know when he lived, but it was back there sometime. Or Plutarch in the 2nd century CE or AD, he says that Osiris and Isis were the king and queen of ancient Egypt, and he knows there are all sorts of myths about the death and resurrection, and he tells us all this. And he said, but in fact, they were a historic king and queen. And this whole approach was a way of demythologizing, because you didn't want to say they were pure fictions. And it does happen, like I just said with Caesar Augustus, that some people get mythologized, true, but you have to ask, do we know, is there enough non-mythical, enough secular or profane evidence? Is there a footprint in the historical record?
And I turn to every group, I page through every book. Still, I can't find the truth. Truth is elusive. I ask the old and wise, how do I reach the skies? Now I see through the lies.
I think, for instance, that the passion narrative of Jesus is composed of bits and pieces from Josephus's Antiquities, where he speaks of various messianic and revolutionary figures who, like John of Giscala, who cleansed the temple of the Leistoi, the thieves in the temple, like, you've made my house a den of thieves, and he was welcomed into the city with palm branches and all of that. Or another one, Simon Bar Gioris, who declared himself king of the Jews during the Roman siege and tried to tunnel his way out of the city, but had to eventually surface and appeared before the Roman troops in full regalia, and then they carted him off to Rome, and he was killed as king of the Jews. The interrogation of Jesus in front of the Sanhedrin and then the procurator Pilate, this sounds amazingly like Jesus ben Ananias, a prophet who for years was predicting that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed, and people didn't like the sound of that, and so they brought him to the Sanhedrin, and then they brought him to the Roman procurator, not Pilate, but the later fellow, one of the guys, I think Cuspius Fadus, or one of these guys, and he interrogated him, and Jesus ben Ananias would say nothing, and so rather than crucify him, he just flogged him and let him go, which is what Pilate is said to have wanted to have done in the Gospels, but then got bullied into having Jesus crucified. Well, some years later, during the Roman siege, as Jesus ben Ananias is walking around wailing for doom on Jerusalem. He gets killed by a flying boulder from a Roman catapult, and so his prophecy was true, and the Romans took over. This is so, I mean, there are little details like the procurator says, "Where are you from?" which is what Pilate asks Jesus and John. It looks like that the gospel writers knew Josephus and decided to borrow this. So was there a historical Jesus? It's sort of like the Frankenstein monster. Pieces of other guys have been put together, but there was no original Frankenstein monster.
Respeitando Ateu, inscreva-se, curta, compartilhe e deixe seu comentário.